Susan, you need to unmute.
For this election for the next 9 days. Are you? I would now like to introduce Tom Sutton, our speaker this morning. He is a professor of political science at Baldwin Wallace University, and he also directs their Community Research Institute. He's taught and conducted research on elections and policy issues for 24 years. He's a well-known political analyst and is quoted on Channel 5, The Plain Dealer, NPR, and other publications. Dr. Sutton has also managed programs for at-risk youth and homeless people during his career. After Dr. Sutton's presentation, we'll open it up for Q&A at 9:30, both here and virtually. If you haven't already done so, please make sure your cell phones are turned off right now, here for those that are here with us in person. Okay, Dr. Sutton, I'd now like to turn this over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks for the generous introduction. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay without microphones and other devices that confuse and exacerbate rather than do their jobs? Technology, our best friend. At any rate, so we're here to talk about the midterms, which are a week from Tuesday. Midterms that are getting clearly signs that people are interested in participating. As you may have seen, in Ohio, over 1 million early ballot requests have been filed. In Michigan, the same, and nationally, about 9 million. So just 2 states are making up 2/9 of the total national figure, and that figure continues to go up as we get closer and closer. And now, of course, this also includes people who are physically early voting by going to their local board of elections and casting their votes. So what I'm going to share is a mix of information related to public opinion, to the candidates themselves in different races. Of course, this is a big issue related to control of the House and the Senate, and also governor's races. We won't dig as deep as state legislatures, although we know in Ohio that's probably not going to change that much. And of course, we have the issue of gerrymandering and how that's affected not just Ohio and redistricting, but across the country. So what I have here is a slide that basically is drawn from 538. It's a source that I use often that does a lot of elections tracking and modeling. They do not do polling themselves. They aggregate polls that are done by other entities, plus do a lot of statistical modeling to do predictive analysis. This is a set of 6 waves of polling that was done, same set of, it's a panel where the same people were polled 6 times on the same issues. And not surprisingly, if you look at this, it's a bit confusing. I've never seen a representation like this. If you're artistic, it's lovely. If you're a charts and numbers guy like me, it's a little disconcerting. But at any rate, basically the top is the most important issue, inflation, not surprising, 65%. And then as you go down, you see over time from April to when this ended in, I believe, October, earlier this month, you had changes in the priorities of these different issues. So crime and violence, pretty high, goes down a little bit, and then that switches with political extremism. Probably, we would say, from wave 5 to wave 6, that might be partly because of the January 6th hearings that resumed after the summer. We have race and racism, you see bumping up and then going down. Abortion, clearly that was at the time the Dobbs decision was issued in June. Climate change, which is interesting, pops up above immigration, and then they switch places a little bit. Government budget debt, I was happy to see that actually got some attention. I thought we had decided just to forget about that issue completely, but apparently it is something that with a $30 trillion debt, we are paying some attention to. And then you can see going on down the line, interestingly, election security has been getting a lot of attention because of those that say that the 2020 election was stolen, et cetera. But according to the polling, it's actually much lower. And so it could be a fringe issue as opposed to a central issue. And then, of course, our favorites, education, taxes, unemployment, natural disasters. If it doesn't affect you, you don't think about it. If this poll had been done in Kentucky or Florida or someplace like that, it probably would have been a lot higher. But this is a national poll, so that's what you're looking at there. So that's kind of the overview of where Americans are and have been for like the last 6 or 7 months. So another poll that was done also by 538, again, they commissioned this poll. This was October 23rd, 13th to 23rd, sample of about 1,000 likely voters. And it's about, well, why are or are not people supporting Democrats continuing in power, right? We have the Democrats who control the House, barely control the Senate and the White House. And you see the reasons that are listed here. Have not earned 2 more years in power. Number one, 68%, policies and plans move Americans in the wrong direction. And then it drops off from there to values and beliefs, haven't done anything important. That's kind of hard to really support given all the things. You may not think it's good, but they've certainly done big things when it comes to the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the big one, of course, the American Recovery Act. Dealing with COVID, pandemic, and economy. The pandemic is really kind of in the rearview mirror for people. And then the Republican Party offers a better alternative, 6%. So people are not necessarily happy with Republicans compared to Democrats, but this is the reasons they don't want Democrats. And then in favor, look at the difference. Policies and plans move America in the right direction, 44%, as opposed to 68% wrong direction. And then from there, you see better than Republicans, 19%. Passed major and important legislation, 17%. So 17% of people knew the legislation was passed and that they consider it important. And then finally, you see shared values and beliefs, 12%. And this is a sampling of a group that includes Republicans, Democrats, and independents. So let's get to the races in the House and the Senate, starting with the House. We have a very slim majority in the House of Democrats compared to Republicans. You see the number there. It's literally a 9-seat spread, including 3 vacancies. Republicans, magic number, they only need to net 5 seats to get the majority in the House. This is a super slim majority. The average midterm loss by party in the White House is 25 seats. The only 2 exceptions, you may remember 1998 when Newt Gingrich overstepped his bounds trying to tie every single person running for office as a Democrat to Bill Clinton. And by the way, this was in the midst of course, the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal. And in 2002, when after 9/11, the Republicans gained power and seats because of George Bush being in the White House and the way that he was perceived to be handling 9/11. And let's be careful to note that that was after the invasion of Afghanistan and before the invasion of Iraq. And then you see the chart basically showing those losses. The biggest losses, of course, were for Democrats. 63 seats lost in 2010, 54 in 1994. And then the more average losses, and then the next biggest one after that was during Trump's era in 2018, 41 seats. So another part of what this indicates is that I would suggest that if you were to ask Americans if they're happy or unhappy, regardless of party, regardless of affiliation, the unhappiness scale would be off the charts, probably for, I'd suggest, the last 20, 25 years at least. even longer. So at any rate, that's kind of where the numbers are and why all the predictions are that the House will, short of a miracle, be in Republican control come November. If we look at the forecast, again, this is 538, we're looking at 81% chance that the Republicans will win the majority according to their modeling. There are only 11 seats that are considered toss-ups out of 435. And with 11, I can give you what those seats are. I don't know that much about them, except that these are, generally speaking, if you take New York, for example, solidly Democratic state, everybody assumed, well, not so much. The governor's race is very tight. The crime issue is very real in New York, whether it's the subway crime or the fact that the New York Republican gubernatorial candidate was attacked on one of his campaign appearances, and also something happened near his house on Long Island, which is actually where I grew up. And so New York is not as predictable as one might have expected. There's one seat there that's a toss-up. You see 2 in Texas. Again, Texas is rapidly changing with its growing metropolitan areas, and so you're more likely to see Republicans at risk than Democrats. And then a scattering of others, including Alaska, where we had the surprise win of a Democrat, Mary Portola, in the special election. And so now to fill Don Young's seat when he passed away. And Alaska will be really interesting because you're going to have 4 candidates on the ballot there because of their use of ranked choice voting come November. What you should note is that if Democrats pick up every one of these 11 toss-ups, which won't happen, they'll still be short of a majority. So they've got to turn some of those Republican lean seats into Democratic seats. So I would suggest, like you shouldn't bet on the Browns, don't bet on Democrats winning control of the House. So at any rate, sorry, bad news. This is Ohio. So if you look at the Ohio numbers, and good, you're not seeing what I'm seeing here, which is this bar blocking the top, no problem. Ohio in some ways is very predictable. We are a Republican majority state, if only by 4 points, according to 10 years of voting. We do have a couple of seats that are safe for Democrats. That would be essentially Joyce Beatty's seat in Columbus and what will be Chantel's Brown's district covering most of Cuyahoga County. What you see in the first column there, after the district names and general sort of where they're located in Ohio, these are essentially the ratings of each district based on Democrat or Republican strength. And as you can see, essentially 12 of the 15 seats are heavily Republican, 2 heavily Democrat, and then we've got 1, really 2, the first district in Cincinnati, D+3, the 13th in the Summit area, R+2. That's the one where Amelia Sykes is running against Madison Giussotto Gilbert. Otherwise, we're looking at safe seats. You see in the last column, 99% Republican, and then the vote margins. Again, these are the predictions of 538. So for Ohio's congressional races, the ones that we're watching are the first district, that would be the Steve Chabot defense race. We're certainly looking at the 9th district, where Marcy Kaptur, even though it's an R+6 district, is running against a first-time candidate who has apparently not been entirely accurate about his military record, and who apparently has figured out that making his lawn into a giant Trump sign was not enough to get him easily elected into that district, even though it was redistricted to be a Republican majority district. And then beyond that, also, the Amelia Sykes Madison Gilbert race, I think, is the other one to watch. Could go either way. Amelia Sykes has better name recognition because of being in the minority later in the Ohio House. But again, and it's only an R+2, so that one could go either way. Okay, moving on to the Senate. You can't get much more slim than this, right? We've got 50 Democrats, 48 Republicans, and 2 independents who side with the Democrats, 50-50 split. And I'm sure most of you have seen info, news coverage, et cetera, about each of these races that are considered the marquee races in the Senate where there is competition. The map that you're seeing, the 2 yellow states are the ones that are officially considered toss-up states. And then you see the 3 orange states are the ones that are essentially leaning Republican, but not guaranteed: Wisconsin, Ohio, and North Carolina. And then we have Pennsylvania, which is a lean Democrat. This is the Fetterman Oz race. And then New Hampshire, which is a lean Democrat. Hassan is the incumbent senator Democrat, but she's facing a pretty tough challenge from Don Baldock, who is very much a Trump person. The other thing that's interesting is that every one of these candidates on the Republican side are either Trump supporters or were endorsed by Trump or both, including Ron Johnson, the incumbent Republican in Wisconsin. So it'll really depend on turnout. Really big issue. We thought the abortion issue was going to make a huge difference in turnout, but according to the polling numbers, that has cooled off as an issue. People are more focused on inflation and the economy, and to a lesser extent, depending on your sector and your party affiliation, the issue of crime. The governor's races. So as far as the governors, currently we have 28 Republican and 22 Democratic governors. Up for election, there are 36 seats, 20 Republican and 16 Democrat. Another forecaster, 270 to win, forecasts 3 leaning Democrat. This is Michigan, where Whitmer is the incumbent. The Maine race and the New Mexico race, all leaning Democrat. Georgia, lean Republican. Stacey Abrams is giving Brian Kemp a run for his money, but I think it's probably likely that Kemp is going to win as an incumbent Republican in Georgia, particularly because the issue of Trump's trying to get the 11,000 votes switched to get him Georgia in that infamous phone call with Rasberger, the Secretary of State, and Brian Kemp. In some ways, that inoculated Kemp in terms of his being part of the whole January 6th steal the election, et cetera, because he actually stood up against Trump and said, no, we're not going to switch votes, as did Rasberger. Toss-ups in the governor's races: Arizona, Kansas, Oregon, Nevada, and Wisconsin, which is really surprising when you look at some of those states, particularly states like Kansas, which has been a solidly Republican state for a long time. But if you recall, a few months ago, Kansans defeated a very strict abortion measure that was proposed to be added to their constitution, and they had unprecedented registration and turnout, particularly by women. That's what gave a lot of people hope, those on the reproductive rights side, that this would carry over into other states. Now it seems to have been watered down again by attention, right? So we had a lot of attention when the 10-year-old left Ohio to go to Indiana to get an abortion, but that was months ago. And we have a tendency to have a memory span politically of probably about 2 weeks. And right now the memory is focused on, what did I pay for gas yesterday, right?
Yes.
So that's that. So it looks like we're probably going to see some change in the governor's seats, but not a huge swell one way or the other. And then, of course, other effects on the 2022 midterms. 2024 hanging over of this, kind of like a cloud. Will Trump win? Will Biden run? Now, Biden has said consistently he will run again. Any sitting president with half a brain will say the same thing, no matter how old or young that person is or how controversial, because the moment Biden says, or somebody says, and he doesn't deny it, that he's not running, he instantly becomes a lame duck and nobody pays attention to him. So look for something new to be said, probably towards the end of 2023. As we get fully into the primary battles, we may start to see 1 or 2 Democrats just standing up and saying, I'm challenging Biden for the presidency, just like Ted Kennedy did back in 1980, challenging Carter, and Ronald Reagan did with Ford in 1976. I really like this audience because I can make those references and you know what I'm talking about. I say these things in my classes and I look at them, oh, right. And now it's become, oh, right, some of your parents weren't born yet. So at any rate, that's an issue. So October surprises, we've had a few already, and we may have another few in the next week or so. I couldn't help but put this cartoon up, of course, what happened with the OPEC decision to cut production, and all the speculation about whether they were doing that for their own economic interests, were they doing it to show their support for Russia, or were they doing it because they don't like Biden? I would suggest it's a little piece of all of the above, and you'll never get anybody in the Saudi government to admit one way or the other. This is right up there with them admitting to being involved in the Khashoggi murders. So at any rate, it certainly does play a part, because somebody standing there with their gas having gone up 40 cents a gallon is not going to think, oh, this is the Saudi conspiracy against Biden, right? because that's really insider baseball. So price of gas, abortion stories. Again, we don't know what's going to happen between now and next Tuesday, and a lot of people do vote on Election Day. Political violence. We certainly saw the terrible attack on Paul Pelosi a couple of days ago. We've heard about other attacks and threats that have been going on around the country. I couldn't begin to predict what kind of effect that'll have on voter turnout. But if something terrible happens between now and November 8th, that could switch a lot of people depending on where they're at. And again, an attack that on either side could mobilize a side. It could mobilize people to vote against whatever happened just because they're disgusted with it. The election doubters, they're still there, and we have some candidates like Kelly in Arizona, Masters in Arizona, others that are saying, well, and Oz has sort of hinted at this in Pennsylvania, well, if I don't win, ... maybe it's because there's election fraud. And Arizona's already been through a recount. We're seeing here in Ohio, you've probably seen some of the stories about demands to get all the election records out in Lorain County and some of these other places, in a state where Trump won by 8 points twice, in a state where every statewide official, with the exception of 3 Supreme Court seats and 1 senator, are Republicans. So I don't think we're going to see that sort of thing, but if J.D. Vance loses, who knows? He may try to mount that, although I suspect that other Republicans will corner him and say, do you want to have a future in Ohio politics? Because if you do, you need to shut your trap and wait for the next cycle. Because most of our Republicans in this state, on the one hand, they toe the line on the abortion issue, and Mike DeWine very proudly signed the heartbeat bill the moment that it came out of the legislature. But on the other hand, our tradition as Republicans in the state is pragmatic conservatives, right? So we didn't see any of our Republican office holders go and hug Trump. In fact, Mike DeWine found everything, including a granddaughter's game, to be reasons to not be on the stage with Trump. He was very clever about that and very careful. And Trump did eventually endorse him, not that I think it made a huge hill of beans difference. But we do have that kind of thing. Now, do we have extremists on the Republican in the State House? Oh, absolutely, right? So we've seen don't say gay bills, we've seen the critical race theory issues, et cetera, in addition to going even further with the abortion issue than we've had with the court decision. So we'll see. The war in Ukraine, that's kind of in the background. I don't know if it's really a salient issue in terms of people's voting, but it's there, and it may be something that some people, I think it's probably more effective for people who support the war effort, voting against a candidate who does not. But again, that becomes you got to be at a pretty intermediate level of foreign policy understanding related to Russia, the potential threat to the rest of Europe, et cetera. And again, we're all focused on inflation and the economy. Mass shootings, again, these come out of nowhere. We had the one recently in St. Louis, the attack on Pelosi. It wasn't a shooting, but it was something like that. Something like that could tip the balance in a couple of states that are really tight. Trump's troubles, right? So take your pick, right? We've got the lawsuit, we've got the prosecution in New York about his companies using their dollars to avoid taxes for some of the employees. We've got the Mar-a-Lago situation with the documents. We've got the possibility of inflating the values of his property in order to get better terms for his loans, et cetera. So he said he was going to drain the swamp, but I think he's got a swamp of his own that he's slowly sinking in, that his supporters, well, you know, everybody's using the image and it's becoming a cliche of the frog in the boiling water. Like at some point, maybe you'll see this. But again, that goes back to, will he run? Anybody's guess, anybody's guess. Candidate missteps, the Fetterman-Oz debate. Fetterman really should not have done a debate. Now, let's just think about this for a moment. Even if Fetterman had not had a stroke. Now, he's apparently pretty decent as a speaker, and he's Mr. Everyman, et cetera, even though he came from wealth. And he was lieutenant governor, or sitting lieutenant governor. But you're going up against a guy who has been on TV for 15 years, right? Just like going up against Trump, who'd been on TV for 10 to 15 years. You better be really prepared to do that. And Fetterman did what he could. He thought he could get past his speech impediments and his hearing impediments because of the stroke. But on balance, on one level, it didn't work. I would suggest that he probably should have skipped that debate. Debates are being skipped left, right, and center by a lot of candidates who say, I don't get anything out of it. It creates a liability. I'm just not going to debate. I understand the Democratic argument in favor of small d. We should all debate each other, et cetera. But honestly, this is about winning a campaign, not about civic responsibility. I hate to be blunt, but that's the thinking. That's why we haven't seen DeWine debate, both now and in 2018. However, at the same time, how many people are undecided about this election, right? There aren't many. Our polling recently showed about a 3.5% undecided margin on the Senate race and the governor's race, et cetera. People pretty much have made up their minds, and on something like this debate, you're not going to see a lot of change. Not much left to mine for voters. Again, these low undecideds. And then we expect a higher than average vote turnout. 19 million early vote ballot requests, over 1 million in Ohio, Michigan I mentioned. But that also means it's going to be that much more unpredictable. For pollsters, this is really bad news, because the more people that turn out to vote, the more unpredictable it's going to be, because everything's based on past patterns, right? We always look back. So if you've got a new ad of voters that you didn't have in 2018 or you didn't have in 2020, then that means that your representative sample may well not be as representative as you had hoped, particularly if they're new registrants, if they're from demographic groups that had low voting and they start to uptick. And as far as pollsters are concerned, that might be bad news, but as far as a democracy is concerned, that's really good news. So I'm all in favor of seeing voter uptick. We saw a really big uptick in 2022, and it's great to see in 2020. It's great to see that we're going to see that again in 2022. All right. And that's that. That's what I got. Questions, discussion. I wanted to leave as much time as possible because you're a group that loves to talk about this stuff.
Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. It is time for our questions. If you're with us virtually, put your questions in the Q&A button, usually at the bottom of your computer. And be sure to click on the anonymous button if you don't want your name to be used. Otherwise, we will use your first name. Thank you. Questions? Let's get started.
Thanks very much for your presentation.
Sure.
This is sort of tangential to your remarks, but before the Supreme Court now, I believe, is a case involving testing the legal theory of the independent state legislature.
Yes.
And were that to be decided in favor of the plaintiffs or whoever is on the side of that theory, could markedly change, and perhaps Joe Biden might be the last Democratic president, because it gives state legislatures, well, why don't you explain it? You can do
Sure.
it better than I can, and the dangers that it faces, offers to democracy.
So in simple terms, one reading of the Constitution, I won't say the right one or wrong or accurate, just one reading, is that the Constitution says that the state shall choose the electors. Now, broadly defined, that's everything from who gets to vote, to how the vote is conducted, to then who is sent to the Electoral College to determine who will be president, right? And it's really that part, I think, that this is looking at. But extended beyond that is that this can affect every election, including local elections. It doesn't say anything more than that. It just says the state shall choose their electors. That's it. Now, a law is a law, and it has to be consistent. And if you're trying to pass laws in a way that will basically override popular vote, well, then you get into the other part of the Constitution that says that every state shall have a Republican form of government in which representatives are elected by the people, right? So that's where you have your legal conflict, I think, in the courts that they have to sort out. And those are both in the Constitution itself, not an amendment. So there can't be any of that argument about, well, this was added later, we don't have to pay attention to it, like they've been doing with the 14th Amendment. Will this court rule in favor of legislatures possibly having the opportunity to ignore what the vote was for the Electoral College and put in their own slate? It's quite possible they might, but then you're going to have a lot of subsequent cases, as we're seeing with the abortion issue, happening in state courts and happening in the federal courts that will continue to challenge that. Ultimately, it may be that after several years of back and forth and election confusion, et cetera, you may wind up with a movement for a constitutional amendment to clarify that part of the Constitution. Short of that, there could be a federal law that clarifies that part, just like we've had with the electoral law from the 1800s, late 1800s, that just got passed that clarified the role of the count of the Electoral College that happened on January 6th. So it's a bit complicated legally and legislatively, but I think that is a real issue. And certainly partisans, particularly on the right, are looking for that to change so that they can take advantage of it. They're already starting as partisans to look at how will we respond if our candidate doesn't win in these different states on November 8th. I'll stop there and see if that helps.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We were, one of our audiences would like you display that initial chart about the changing priorities issue. We can kind of leave that up while we're asking questions. That might be helpful to some people.
Sure. This one? Oh, need to get that back on screen.
It may or may not happen.
Okay. So is there a particular question about the chart?
There isn't, but while the people are digesting that, here's a question from Dick. He's wondering, will appeals to the extremes or appeals to the political center be more likely to be successful in 2022 in Ohio or the United States? Did your pollsters look at that?
We didn't look at that specifically, but if you look at independents, I think are your best gauge of that. We saw independents more likely, independents and actually some Republicans were the gap between their interest in voting for J.D. Vance and who is their candidate, if we take the Republicans, right, as well as the gap for independents voting for J.D. Vance was much higher than it was in voting for Tim Ryan. Now, Ryan has moved to the center. He has voted as a Democrat pretty typically in a lot of the recent spending bills, et cetera, but he came out against the student loan forgiveness program that Biden announced, saying, well, what are blue collar workers getting out of that who didn't go to college? My informal response would be, and what about those blue collar workers who are sending their kids to college and co-signing on their loans? I think they are getting something out of it. However, I think there is in Ohio some reaction against Vance, which is why our poll is showing that Ryan actually has a 4-point lead. We're one of the only ones showing him with a lead, so I'm a little nervous, and it may be our last political poll, depending on how it turns out. But it's obviously a really tight race within the margin of error. I think the extremes will continue. I think there is quite the possibility that extremes, if they feel like they're not being heard, some of them will turn violent, as we've already seen. But the violence actually has a paradoxical effect. It doesn't galvanize, it alienates. And so you'll see more and more people who might have been attracted to the more extreme side but weren't violent, starting to move back and saying, you've gone too far. And perhaps part of what I'm speaking is simply an empirical hope, but I do think that that's where we're going. The other part of it is that inflation is not an extremist issue. Recession is not an extremist issue. And quite frankly, they're issues that we struggle with because there is no easy answer, right? When you say that the Federal Reserve is the primary tool that we have to deal with the inflation issue, and the only way they can do that is to raise interest rates, that's not a political solution intentionally, right? It's really more of a economic version of a bad storm that we have to ride out. Now, can things be done on the margins related to government spending or tax cuts, et cetera? Yes, but those are not the kinds of issues that extremists are interested in. Quite frankly, we're going to see this sort of reaction for the time being going forward, partly because the bottom root issue, I'm convinced, and some polling, not ours, but some polling shows this, it's about identity. Our country is changing demographically, and as long as that's happening, we're going to continue to see, I think, these conflicts among different sides. And certainly the Southern Poverty Law Center data that's showing continued continued increase in the activism of extremist groups on both sides, right? So we've got black nationalist groups, we've got white supremacist groups, we've got all kinds of things. 784 groups. I just did something the other day on this. 784 extremist groups are documented by the Southern Poverty Law Center. 20 are active here in Ohio, including the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, and some of the other ones. But again, that's on the margins, and it's bad because individuals will get hurt, innocent people will get hurt, but I don't think that's necessarily something that's going to move the spectrum when it comes to our politics.
You know, on the news the other night, I was a little disappointed. They were talking about the Pelosi incident, and one of the commentators, and he was on PBS, I was kind of disappointed, but said, oh, well, also, you know, it's happening on the left too, you know, they threatened Kavanaugh. I think that's, I don't know, what do you think about that? When, you know, they start saying, oh, it's that side too, you know?
Well, yeah, that's sort of the diminishing of the effect or trying to show that they're balanced. There have been threats on the left, the Kavanaugh examples given. Nobody entered his house. It was things that were happening with doxing, and that's been going on for a long time, putting out people's addresses and phone numbers, et cetera. But if you add up the number of incidents on the left and the right, the number of incidents on the far right is off the charts. The number of incidents on the far left are minimal, unless you accept the theory that everything that happened related to the Black Lives Matter protests was actually Antifa, and that it was extremists that were running, et cetera, which is simply not true.
That's why it seems to me it's inappropriate to even say that.
Yeah, I would agree. And I heard similar, well, then there was the comment, who was it? It was one of the candidates who said, well, we're going to, still in all, we're still going to send Nancy back to California. And it was sort of playing on that same issue and should have just kept his mouth shut. I don't remember who it was that said it offhand, but yeah, it's taking advantage of a terrible situation. And quite frankly, the larger context of this, I would be doing more to tie that attack together with the mass shootings that have been happening, other kinds of violent incidents where the one common denominator is that it's very clear that the people involved in doing these things, number one, they're loners, and that's what the FBI has identified. These are not people who are acting on behalf of a group. They may say they follow a group, but they're not being put up to it by a group per se. They're being encouraged, they're being cajoled, but they're also people who are suffering from a distorted sense of reality. Let's put it that way, right? Is it a diagnosable mental illness or not? We don't know. This is part of the problem with red flag laws. The idea that we'll take their guns away if they have some kind of mental health issue. Well, doesn't that mean it has to be diagnosed first? And don't we have something called HIPAA that protects your confidentiality when it comes to all things medical? So I've never understood what that was. But the bottom line is we've got a larger social issue when it comes to people who are suffering from distorted reality and are lured into doing these extremist things because of all the rhetoric that they're seeing on social media in particular, and to a lesser degree in the news. But that requires a lot of self-regulation that the people in these corners are not interested in doing.
Did your pollers look at this issue of judicial elections now being party affiliated?
Yes, we did. We didn't ask the question specifically about party affiliation, but we certainly saw that in the results. So for the Ohio State Supreme Court races, we saw for all three seats, the Chief Justice seat and the other two justice seats, that Republicans are favored by 7 or 8 points. The undecideds are about 6.5%, which is actually pretty low, given that we asked about Supreme Court races. I had to fight to get those questions in because I had colleagues that were like, nobody cares about the court. I said, nobody cares about the court? Hello, gerrymandering and abortion.
Isn't there something about being an independent judiciary in our Constitution?
Well, but the majority of state courts are elected. And of those, many use party affiliation. And let's be fair, if you're paying attention to party affiliation, you know who the Republicans and the Democrats are. So personally, I'm not in favor of elected judges. I would prefer to see appointments by independent commissions. with a mix of legislators, governor's office people, and citizens who are not attorneys. Sorry, we'll put some attorneys in there too.
Okay, here we go. Can you speak a little bit about how you find the people that you do the surveys on?
Great question. So how do we do polling? We use what are called web panels. And so basically a web panel is where you have a group of people who have agreed to take polls. There are tens of thousands of those people in these pools, if you will. We work with a company called Survey USA, which has gotten very excellent ratings. They've been around since the 1970s. We've worked with other companies. We've worked with Qualtrics before. We paid more to work with Survey USA to get more accurate results, and we'll find out if it worked or not. But essentially, because the response rate has gone down so much for phone polling, now some entities still do phone polling, it's gotten much more expensive, and you really have to raise the question, is it representative if certain groups of people don't answer? With web panels, you at least can get the demographics distributed. So rather than looking at a random sample of Americans or registered voters, likely voters, et cetera, instead, you want a stratified sample that represents, if you weight it to, for instance, the 2020 census, right? So we want to know in Ohio, when we did this poll, that we have a certain breakdown based on age, gender, race, ethnicity. We also do it for education, so that what we get in that sample mirrors what we see in the state itself. Now, there are some that will weight it to past election results. We did not do that. I find that to be really unpredictable, given the uptick of turnout in 2020, given that 2018 was open seats versus incumbents running again, which has a huge effect on voter turnout and on voter results. Certainly in this state, we're seeing that. So that's essentially how we get our sample. Here's what's happening with phone polling. When we started 17 years ago, and we were not doing political polling, we were doing work for local government and nonprofit agencies, which we still do. And we have a 20-station survey center. Students did the calling. It always was good when we had, hi, I'm Joe from Baldwin, Wallace University. I'm a student here, and I just want to ask you a few questions. That always gave us a huge advantage. We would get 2 surveys completed per hour. The last time we did one of these was the mayoral race last year in Cleveland. It took 2 hours to get 1 survey completed. And recently I saw from 538 in one of their articles that they were showing a 0.2% response rate on phone calling. 0.2%. So that's why many entities are going to auto dial IVR, which is basically where, if you've ever gotten a call where it's a machine that's asking you to push 1, push 2, push 3 for your choices. I can't believe this is, they only do it for landlines, which is also disappearing. They do that as part along with web panels. Morning Consult, if you've seen polls from them, Morning Consult is a ginormous polling firm, but their bread and butter business is market surveys for companies. So what they do is they get people to answer company surveys, and I mean like the big oil companies and the consumer product companies, et cetera. So they have literally 50, 60, 70,000 people at any one time who have answered surveys. And then they'll plug in a political survey, but it's not even a randomized sample. It's not even a web panel. It's just, let's see how many people we can get. They'll get 10, 15,000 responses to a political sample, to a political survey, which is such a huge number that they can then stratify to their heart's content and pick out the responses and say, well, this looks like a good representative sample of completed surveys from African-American women or from Asian-American men of a certain age, et cetera, because they just have this enormous numbers. That's why they are now rising. They've partnered with Politico, which is probably one of the best sources for neutral, straight political reporting. I was able to make a check mark on my bucket list because I got a call from a Politico reporter the other day and did an interview with him. It was just like, oh. So I got New York Times, I got Wall Street Journal, I got Politico. I can retire now. So it's a great question. And even with that, there's still this issue of the gap between who answers and who votes. Now, we did one recently this summer for the ACLU. This is inside information, so you have to promise me you won't tell anybody about this. So it was an internal poll that they wanted to do because they're mounting a grassroots organizing effort in Southeast Ohio. And so what they wanted to do was a poll about elections, election security, issues that they deal with related to justice reform, et cetera. Here's what they wanted in the sample. They named 11 counties in Southeast Ohio with a total population of 500,000 people. Rural Southeast Ohio, Belmont County, place like that. They wanted a sample of 600 Trump-supporting voters. Now, not hard to get Trump-supporting voters down there, but to try to get a sample of 600 to answer the poll, the Survey USA group, this is why we work with them, they did it. They found them. And we got some fascinating results about what they support, what they don't support, et cetera, et cetera. So that gives me hope. We worked really hard to make sure that we got regions of the state represented. We have 1,000 sample. If you see a sample of anything below 800, cast out, because particularly if you do the demographics, because just look at the numbers, right? If you just take a sample of 800 gives you roughly a 3.5, 4, about a 4% margin of error. But if you split that in half and say, well, women think, well, now you've got a sample of 400, that goes up to 5.5% margin of error, which you have to double, really. So that's really 11%. And then if you get, sorry, I know the number's just crazy, but I'm geeking out here. So then New York Times the other day had an article that was talking about their poll with Siena College, which is one of the big names, which is really funny because they're about the same size of students as we are, BW. Same with Marist, but they started this stuff in the 70s and they've just become bigs, and they're in New York, so that's part of it. But at any rate, Siena did a poll. New York Times reported on independent women in the sample. Well, if you take independent women, you know what the number was? 122 in a national sample. Bad, New York Times, bad. Now, I heard about this from the guys at 538 on their podcast that were talking about how bad that was. And they were essentially saying, don't pay attention to crosstabs, which is where you look at gender, you look at household income, you look at education, et cetera. But if you don't pay attention to that, then what do you have left? What do you do? And internal polling that campaigns do, they're doing this all the time. They're doing micro-targeting. 4 years ago, I talked to 2 Republican consultants for the national party that came into town to talk about their strategy. They had micro-targeting, this is like this, 3,000 data points per voter. 3,000 data points. I asked my students, can you come up with 20 things about yourself? And it's everything. It's everything. Right? Did you go to hear a talk about midterm elections at the Unitarian Universalist Church on a Sunday recently? Boom, they know it. Sorry, sounds like a surveillance state. At any rate, I hope that helps. And you asked me a question I just couldn't help going on and on and on. She's like, I'm never asking him again. What else?
To what extent do voters make up their minds during the campaign, meaning in the 3 months or so before the election versus even before the campaign?
It's a great question. Great question. I think a lot of voters, I don't have a percentage, but if you look at, if you look at some polling data that was done, say, over the summer compared to now, you'll see in the Undecideds where that's really your measure. And in some cases, it's as high as 20, 30, 40%. Particularly if you have an open seat where they don't know who the 2 candidates are. Or if you have a situation where the incumbent is someone that maybe has some controversy, but the newcomer that's trying to vote against them, that's trying to run against them, isn't well known. The Fetterman-Oz race would be a good example of that. I think the Vance-Ryan race is a good example of that as well. So even in states where you think one party's going to win, Utah, right? So Utah votes Republican reliably, but in their Senate seat right now, they've got this guy, Evan Mullen, who was Republican, now is running as an independent, and he's running against Mike Lee, the Republican. it's not too close to call, but it's within 4 or 5 points, which is much closer than you would expect. So I think you do see that kind of thoughtfulness by voters. The other is that voters really don't start tuning in until after Labor Day. Because look at your turnout in primaries versus the general election. Primary turnout is typically 20 or 30%. General election in the midterm is somewhere around 45 to 50% of registered voters. I think it's going to be probably 55% this time, given what we're seeing in the trends. But to your question, that tends to be the attention line when it comes to where people start paying attention. And we're all living busy lives. And so unlike political junkies like me, most people have other things to focus on and do, and focus on this at the point where it's kind of like, oh yeah, I got to go see the doctor today. And politics can be that. And quite frankly, unless you're a political junkie, who would follow this stuff any more than they have to?
This is a good segue, so I asked for the mic because you set up the contrast between primary voting and general voting.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the primaries dictate. Closer? Better?
That's good.
Yes.
The primaries shape the general.
Yep.
And I read enough about this stuff to be just kind of gradually, cumulatively persuaded that the party primary system is narrowing our choices down towards people who are protecting against the extreme flank, and therefore themselves are being pushed towards that flank so they can cover it. And my view is that this is becoming pretty darn obvious as a fundamental difficulty for our democracy. And yet I don't have much of any knowledge about states that are beginning to move towards some kind of ranked choice voting or open primaries, or what the possible avenue of change might be in the nation towards moving away from solely a single party primary voting towards something which is more likely to drive people towards the middle rather than the extremes.
Right. So great question about the extremes being the dominant group in primaries, right? And to your point, the ones that might be more established, more moderate, feeling they have to stay on the extreme in order to continue to win the primary. That you're more likely to face a primary challenge than you are to face an opponent in the general election. And of course, that's the cumulative effect of reapportionment and gerrymandering, where you have safe districts all over the country. You saw the slide that I showed on how many toss-up seats, 11 toss-up seats, and another dozen or so that are lean Republican, lean Democrat out of 435 seats. That tells you a lot, right? So the safe seats, it's really a competition that gets ended in the primary. How you fix that is and the problem is that more and more of the moderates are the ones that are driven out. So they are not as much of a voice to try to change it. The most effective way to change it is to increase turnout in primaries. Increase turnout in primaries and try to get people to vote for the more moderate candidate and encourage moderate candidates to run. The problem is a lot of folks that tend to be more moderate, pragmatic, are also the ones that look at that whole system and say, and why would I do this? How am I helping my community this way? I have the same thing with my students. They all are interested in politics, but none of them want to have anything to do with it.
Well,
Except
look at
to
how
vote.
much money you have to raise too. My daughter
sure.
was tapped for a seat that didn't end up existing in this state house. $300,000 she'd have to raise for a job that pays $40,000, and
Yep.
you have a family, and
Yep.
who could do that? Who can possibly run for politics these days?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, we have time for one more question before we have to turn it.
I have a question about possible ticket splitters. What percentage of people do you think are Republican, but they're voting Democrat, or Democrat and they're voting Republican? And what races would you see that happening in, if at all?
Here in Ohio, I think you're going to see that obviously in the Senate race versus the governor's race. There's a 17-point difference between DeWine and Nan Whaley right now, according to our poll, and all the other polls are somewhat in the same. When we asked about favorability of the different candidates and office holders, there was about a 27% who either were uncertain or didn't know who Nan Whaley was. So sorry, but I don't see her going anywhere. Now, where the split is we see an 8-point gap between people who are Republican voting for DeWine or saying they're going to vote for DeWine and those that say they're going to vote for Vance. So I think where you're going to see it is it's going to happen there. We saw the same thing 4 years ago with Sherrod Brown versus Dick Cordray. Cordray got 220,000 fewer votes than Sherrod Brown. So those folks voted, and they voted for Brown, but they didn't vote for Cordray. Now, did they vote for DeWine, or did they just not vote in the gubernatorial seat? Hard to say. I don't have the analysis on that. But we do see that kind of drop off, and it's not necessarily down ticket drop off because people just stop voting. It's definitely about choices. And I think that's part of what's kept this Senate race in Ohio competitive and why every vote counts.
Thank you so very much for an excellent presentation. I really appreciate your expertise and your commitment to being here with us this morning.